What's up, Robyn?
Hey, how are you?
I swear, you are just so you put all the people that look super cool on camera up first. That comes on every time I see her post and your post on Facebook or Instagram or whatnot. I think I really need a selfie class, and then I realized I'm just not that cool, so I should just use microphones, not.
So here's the deal. If you and I go shopping, which I'm happy to take you shopping,
Oh, this sounds awesome.
you too maybe could make the Dapper Q list.
Oh,
Yeah.
life goal just got added.
I'm just saying. I'm just saying.
This is what Speakeasy exists for, Mike. It's to bring people together for fashion.
That's actually the unstated goal. How did you know?
I know.
I want to be on the shopping trip.
Before we start talking, you better give your introduction to Robyn. Otherwise, We're going to get talking about Jesus, because when the Spirit arrives, you can't hold back.
That's right. So Robyn Henderson Espinoza is a self-identified Christian agnostic and queer. I'm going to butcher this, Robyn, so please help me out. Is it mestizaje? How do I pronounce this word?
Mestizaje?
Mestizaje, which means of Mexican and Anglo heritage. She recently earned her PhD in the joint doctoral program at the University of Denver in constructive philosophical theology, which just sounds hella impressive, I have to say, with a primary interest in theology and ethics of interrelatedness stemming from a new materialist account. Robyn is a dapper queer, a lover of solid IPAs, and committed to a theology of radical difference, disrupting the norm and all things queer. Welcome, Robyn.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. So this is our second guest today, Speakeasy bloggers, talking about the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Jesus. If you're joining us.
One thing I forgot to say is that if you get the book before the end of the day on the 8th of November and forward the receipt to bonus@trippfuller.com, then I'm going to send you 4 different high gravity classes, one on radical theology, Christology, religion science, and that kind of thing. But just go to homebrewed.com and homebrewedchristianity.com.
Or look in the lower right-hand corner, because I just sent the link.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, Tripp is generously giving away $120 worth of online courses, 3 of which he's done with Pete, 1 of which he's done with Philip Clayton around, epistemology, science, etc. All you got to do is order the book in a timely manner, and it'll be yours. All this good.
It's sold out on Amazon, but they're back ordered. But
yeah, keep ordering, and there's also other channels you can order from. That link sends you to anywhere you might want to buy the book, including your local bookstore. That'll work too.
They said they're getting more in tomorrow, so it will be back ordered.
Okay, awesome.
I still don't have a physical copy though, so.
Yeah, me neither. Goodness gracious. So Robyn, what are your thoughts about Jesus or Tripp or the Homebrewed Guide in whatever order?
So we don't have that much time to answer all of those questions.
A little note. We actually have a little bit of time, longer than 15 minutes for you, if you want it. We could actually go until the top of the hour. So it's up to you.
Okay. So first, let me just say that I don't use female pronouns. My pronouns are they and them. So please note that. And then the other thing I want to say, so I read this book this morning while I was having my coffee in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I'm doing work for the week. And I think what strikes me, and, I'm a big lover of process thought. I'm a big lover of sort of relational theologies. And I think what strikes me about this book is the particular foundationalism that produces this sort of certainty, or a theology of certainty. And so I was very interested in the skeptic or believer chapter. And I kept coming back to the ways in which certainty keeps showing up. And then I sort of asked myself, how does this certainty then reinscribe the normative for Christianity and for sort of our ideas about Jesus? And so I feel like Beck kind of set me up to ask this question in many ways, because I felt like Beck was alluding to maybe the uncertainty of things and maybe the mystery of things. And so I kind of wanted to start there around how do we address mystery, and also kind of going back to your freestyle Christianity guest, if Jesus or Christology is rooted in a sort of eschatological frame, how does that also reinscribe certainty and a sort of particular teleological thinking around Jesus? And so my questions are about foundationalism and certainty, because I'm not invested in that type of thinking as a queer scholar. So I kind of would just like to start there.
Is there a particular one of them, or do you?
I mean, I think I'm interested in the certainty question. And
so I'll try one way is one affirmation of mystery theologically is perpetually deferring. Another is insistence on our speech giving priority to God's own self-testimony or revelation or whatnot. And I think that one of the difficulties philosophically is that our general concept of kind of theism, atheism, that we then develop the frameworks for understanding and doing Christian theology are often a priori cut off the possibility of God's own self-testimony or having a kind of robust affirmation of revelation. And I say that, like, in my head, I kind of regularly go back and forth by whether or not it is or isn't possible. That's one part of the skeptic and believer side in my own being. But as a Christian, as a minister, like, part of the way of even being situated in the church is that a leap of faith into identifying God's self-testimony in Christ. From that place, the places that certainty normally exist in Christian theology, I tend to open them up. So you have eschatological confidence without security or a set endpoint. You have teleological commitment but the teleology comes from the particularities of the present situation rather than some eternal forms set elsewhere or the mind of God. Now, those two questions are obviously in the dissertation part of it, not the book for normal people. But I do think that, like, what you're spotting is one of the most uncomfortable things to do, to still do theology where it comes in response to God's own self-testimony in Christ. And that's why the first chapter is important to recognize. Christology is crazy, and can you still do it today in light of these tensions and uneasiness around foundationalism, certainty, and things?
Yeah, so this is where I think queer theory could actually be helpful for you.
This is why I need to go. I want to hear it because this is exciting.
So I feel like you were getting to it a little bit when you were talking about the excess with freestyle. I'm sorry, I don't know their name. The freestyle Yosef. So I feel like you were getting to this a little bit when you were using the language of excess. And I'm invested in a Jesus as a non-confessing theologian, right? Because to confess is to adhere to some sort of certainty or framework of certainty. And I just don't have the confidence, epistemologically, right? I just can't know. So I'm invested in a Jesus that propagates this sort of radical excess, the God beyond God. And I feel like, I feel like Meister Eckhart develops this in his God beyond God. And I would like to see, I think part of me says, how does this not reinscribe the sort of liberal, white, progressive Christianity that says everything is okay as long as we give charitably and not stand in solidarity, right? Those are different things. And so I think that the Christology of solidarity recognizes a particular excess, the sort of divine in us, right? This is, I think, Beck's whole ministry at Gateway. The Christology of charity is the sort of is a Christology framed by a particular foundation that I think reinscribes the logic of white supremacy. Mm-hmm. And so in as much as I want to advocate for radical difference, that is not outside of the interconnectedness of race, class, gender, sexuality, etc. So,
well, in the book, I don't argue for charity. I mean, it's pretty directly that to do Christology is a critique of global capitalism and the commodified notions of identity that exist in the market. So now the other part about it that I wondered in figuring out the best way of even saying it is to say that the position of, because you said like, I'm not trying, I can't confess. How, maybe this would be helpful. How would you describe the rejecting of confessing in response to kind of the opening and the closing of the book, where to confess Jesus as the Christ isn't a confession based on certainty, but actually it's an affirmation of its absurdity, and it's a affront to any objective inscribing visions of objectivity and power that would want to possess both the Christian confession or its rejection. That when the leap of faith is in embrace of the absurdity, how do you see that notion of confession similar or different to confession as you were using the word?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a big part of me that resonates with an absurd faith or a vulnerable faith, right? But that absurd faith is like not found in the hipster theology of like reifying broness that I think proliferates. I mean, I just think it proliferates in our white liberal churches. I think what I want to see is the absurdity of, and I think Beck alluded to this, the absurdity of, people who are underhomed preaching the gospel. Mm-hmm. As absurd as that is, right? So I read that and I know you, so I know that you have this commitment to dismantling global capitalism, both in your theology and practice. But there's a point where the corporatizing of theology in our churches, I think, creates not an absurd faith, but a very, very sort of standard normative faith. And like, I can't get on with that. So I'm much more comfortable with a sort of misfit theology, as Beck talks about. And also the real vulnerability of, I mean, I can get on board with this leap of faith business. I like Kierkegaard's work, but what I don't find, at least in the book, is the sort of core value or commitment to the existential, right? To living in the liminal space, or nepantla, right? This in-between space of the sort of radical unknowing. That's where the real vulnerability is for me, I think. Going back to the Hebrew Bible, where Isaac, is willing to sacrifice his son, right? And maybe that is an image of a vulnerable faith, that he was willing to take the leap.
When Kierkegaard does even the way he takes the sacrifice of Isaac's story is as an example of faith as the suspension of the ethical, and that's one of the places in the book, and there are 3, where I talk about, I'm appropriating eschatology as the surplus of possibility at each moment of event, which should never be in the book, because you would have got that and no one else would have. And then like, it's supposed to be about Jesus, but it's talking about eschatological surplus of possibility and becoming of an event. But the places I put it, it's actually one of those, that morality, like when God functions as the guarantor of morality, of law, then it's no longer Christian, because the leap of faith is a subjective thing, not a guarantor of any objective law. Yeah. Because law, by definition, functions by inscribing things. It takes the sheer multiplicity of existence, life, reality, and then it brackets them off, and then it becomes unaware that the state of the law includes these things in this order, valued and not valued, and is unaware of what it's excluded. The power of the law is that this discourse that shapes our own material existence and relations functions as one, like God, the power of the one. And the Kierkegaard's the teleological suspension of the ethical in The Sacrifice of Isaac is to say that faith isn't faith in some morality properly set, even if it's as radical and leftist as we think it should be. And then the other place in the book I do it is around religion itself, so that Christ is not just the foundation in a sense of Christian theology, but it is the foundation that opens up, but it's also the criticism of Christian thought. The church becomes permanently criticized by the cross, and that's another place where possibility gets broken in. And the other one is culture, which in our age has a lot to do with the economy and nation states and such. But what I was hoping to do at the end when I bring back up the skeptical believer thing is to say that it's more radical for the church, and we'd probably be better off as a species if the church was heretical when it came to the true religion, namely the economism. And that one of the ways we become heretical is by identifying ourselves with the outsider and the underside. And that's precisely how God identifies God's self in Christ. And the location of Christ in our world is the crucified people. And I do that kind of reading of John Sobrino connected to the eco-feminist reading of Elizabeth Johnson to kind of point the church to say, should you want to attend to God, it's on the margins, it's in the poor, the oppressed, it's at communion where our identities are shed and we're found ourselves as brothers and sisters at the same table and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and
I'm going to interrupt, unfortunately, because I feel like a UFO abductee. I had missing time. Robyn, I apologize. We are out of time at this moment. However, if you can jump back on later, I'm going to message you a couple times when you might be able to come back on, because I would like to do this conversation.
Sure.
It is always an honor to get to talk to you, Robyn, and hopefully you'll get to subvert the norm, because then we can do it for like an hour in front of people.
Yeah, totally. So, let's do it.
Awesome.
All right.
Great. Talk to you soon again, hopefully.
Yeah. Bye, y'all.
See, that was an answered prayer.
Yeah. So I want to go back to, because you kept bringing it up, the teleological suspension of the ethical. I want to go back to that. And I want to go back to that because I'm not convinced that neither the individual nor God can predict the leap. That the leap is such a sort of radical liminality, or it thrusts us into this radical liminality that escapes all certainty. And I still see the arc of the book tracing the lines of a sort of a particular certainty that I think conforms to the normative in many ways. And because I don't think you're here's the deal. Politically, I don't think you're invested in that. But it shows up in your theology.
Well, maybe a specific example of it would be helpful, or a place it shows up, or does does having a Christological norm that remains open and undefined necessarily problematic?
Well, I think having a Christological norm by default is a process of naming. And I think that we are far too entangled in materiality or as matter that entanglement displaces contours of the normative.
Yeah, and I guess the one way of putting it is, it is attending to naming, and the theological side of it is that attending to God's self-thematization in Jesus is a methodological way of avoiding naming or inscribing in the place of religion and power and that type of discourse, the unnamed powers of the present. Because at least in the past, when I've discussed similar things with one of my friends who would Judith Butler, my commentary, the issue has been around if the doctrine of revelation that that has existed in church history is inherently problematic, because then you have a monotheism, which is problematic, and they argue for more of a multiplicity of the divine or a polydoxy of the divine, and that would be kind of the theological appropriation of the critique I'm sensing, but I'm just trying to locate it and see if that might be it.
Well, I mean, sure. So I would be all for a sort of polydoxy and a panentheism. And I think both of those, I think they get at the sort of theology of radical difference that after which I am chasing. And I think I worry that our liberal theologies, our white liberal theologies, not only reinscribe the normative, but they're reinscribing the logic of white supremacy that names things in a certain fashion, profoundly so, and that then perpetuate things like all lives matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would never use the hashtag.
Right.
In the book, I try to address the question in the reading of the Syro-Phoenician woman.
Uh-huh.
I don't remember where that is because I still don't have a physical copy of my book to mark up myself. But in it, what I talk about is that to include insights from the ever-expanding surplus of the divine is for the church to make the same type of moves in the theological voices it engages, affirms, hears critiques and stuff from, in the same way that Jesus did with the Syro-Phoenician woman. So as she kind of asks a question and he hears it framed right by the dominant narrative of Israel, of giving priority to the people, of the covenant over the other, she's like, can you help me out? He's like, no, this is for Israel. And, he calls her a dog. And she says, even the dog gets scratched from the table. And in response to it, you see Jesus' vocation expand, or his identity expand. And one of the larger problems throughout the history of the church and theology is our inability to recognize in the critical voices we have just learned to attend to the actual voice of Christ. And Jesus in that text is having to hear that the call of what it means to be the Christ from the other. In one account, it's a Syro-Phoenician woman. The other, it's a Canaanite woman. And they didn't even exist anymore. And the reason Canaanite women didn't exist anymore is because they were eliminated by the people of Israel who understood God to have sent them off on a genocidal crusade. And what I'm hoping to do in telling the story is to talk about to use it as a model for the church to listen, to hear, and to be transformed by voices it hasn't attended to before. So because the Christ ends up being the voice who's speaking at Christ versus Jesus, if that makes sense.
So, I mean, I think I'm all for like prophetic witnesses, and here I want to go back to Beck's illustration of when we recognize, and I will affirm that thing that my liberation is bound up in yours, right? And that it's about collective liberation, but that Beck says, as soon as it's not until I recognize that the divine is in you. And I think that move requires, I think, a suspension of certainty.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not convinced that white American religion has latched onto that. And I think what we have in like movements of like progressive evangelicals, and by that I don't mean like you, Tripp. I mean the still sort of conservative, progressive evangelicals who are exporting homophobia into Rwanda via Starbucks and Costco.
Mm-hmm.
That they are using contours of certainty to frame a particular dominionist American exceptionalism that is reinscribing the logic of white supremacy. Mm-hmm. I think the danger in your book is not that you mirror them, but that those folks who follow the Rick Warren and that whole like saddlebag mentality and others like it, the Phil Driscoll, for example, too, is that they can see a plumb line of certainty in your work that resonates with them. And I actually, because I know that you are grounded and committed to a relational theology and a process-oriented God, I worry that then your book could be like used in ways that like you don't intend it to. So what I would like to see is more attention to not a theology of charity per se, but a deep, deep theology of solidarity, and to see more of the sort of spirit of deep incarnation that I think gets at difference.
Well, I mean, there's a whole chapter on a Christology of solidarity and Christology of sarx.
So I read that and I was like all about like flesh. Yes. And, Maida Rivera's new book on the poetics of flesh, I'm all about bodies. I'm all about matter. I'm all about flesh. What I worry about is the logic reinforces a type of certainty that I'm not sure you're committed to. That's all. And we can spend the next 10 years, debating this and talking about this.
Uh-huh. I wonder if Tripp's book can serve as a conveyor belt, though, for people who are kind of still within conservative evangelicalism, who are reassured, hopefully not in their most, racist and homophobic tendencies, but reassured that, okay, Tripp's on Team Jesus, as I understand Team Jesus, and I'm going to, listen, and it's sort of like a gateway drug. I doubt Tripp has said all that he wants to say about theology and spirituality in his first solo authored book. So I don't know. I mean, is it possibly a both and, or do you still see that as harmful, Robyn, if it's not like cards on the table here?
Well, I mean, so I'm a big believer in both and. I mean, sure. I think probably it both could be a conveyor belt and an invitation. And also what I worry about is that invitation is also an invitation to stake one's position in a particular certainty that reinscribes the normative, and displaces excess, for example. And this is just where I think things like queer theory could help, and why. I mean, it's part of the reason why I'm deeply invested in process philosophy, because I think they get at some of this stuff, and why I think theology and principle. I mean, it's why we have. It's why we have the 7 ecumenical councils, right? It's to establish a framework of thinking, and we really have inherited just bad theology in many ways. And I think because like you, Tripp, I'm invested in it. I think the church is the best thing we have on earth. And my atheist and agnostic friends are going to flip the shit out. But, when I was in seminary, Nancy Bedford taught me that, and taught me that what we have in the church and the possibility we have in the church is really where prophetic witness happens and transformation happens. You know what? I believe that. I absolutely believe that. So I'm invested in this at a very, very basic level. What I'm not invested in is institutionalized theology and institutionalized frameworks that reinscribe logic of domination and the coloniality of logic. And so I get worried about certainty.
So here's what I'd love to see, because we're at time now. Should you choose to blog about this, Robyn, I would love to see like a next steps reading list, be those books, blog posts, videos, etc., for people who are engaging with this but want to go further, want to learn from queer theory and theology, and how to move forward.
Sure.
And one of the things that and Mike said that might, like, the logic of the book is to actually talk to most of the people in the church. But at no point in the book did I say to myself, you know who I'm writing this for? Robyn. Because, like, we share so many things already in common, and this conversation is one you only have if you love the church or invested in different forms of criticism. Right. And like, the framing of the book goes, chapter 1, don't worry, I'm talking about Jesus and saying something robust. Then dealing with enlightenment issues in chapters 2 through 4, dealing with questions that are provoked by postmodernism more directly, and then dealing with a political and ecological crisis. And my goal was to allow a greater percentage of the church to get to the point they hear an eco-feminist Christology at the end, or a liberation Christology at the end, and then go, yep, that makes sense, because it is completely crazy to think that God was revealed in a homeless dead Jew. And if God was revealed in that homeless dead Jew, that this is the crucified God, then the crucified people of this world, including the Dolphins, are ones that I am to be committed to, identify with, and to be disturbed by. That's the that's the logic of the book.
So I got to interrupt your preaching, because we got to move on. These
well, we're going to. Robyn and I will do a blab from Subvert the Norm. That's the long-winded version.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. I'll be in touch.
Awesome. After we go shopping.
Yes, after we go shopping. Yes, in Missouri of all places.
Well, awesome.